Stop. Talk to me.
Hello.
Hi, Crystal. We're about to talk about a conversation that on the surface could sound uninteresting to people because it's about impact investing. It's a part of the business that we don't spend a lot of time talking about. It's how foundations have an impact beyond their grant making. And the person on our team who has been leading our work in that area has been Gil Alvarado, who is our chief financial and investment officer. And we decided to let him out from behind the veil. To talk a little bit about this. And this was your idea. Tell me why you thought this was important.
Gil is, well, one, he presents with dad jokes, which are hilarious. There are none in this podcast episode.
Right.
But I think Gil is just making the connections on what does community impact look like when you use every last dollar you have to really help the community in terms of investments. And the way he explains it, once you sit down, it's so accessible and it feels like something more leaders in community could do. So I just figured, like, he's a gem. Why not have him share what you and he talk about all day and how we're trying to help improve San Diego's future for the long term.
Thank you. I thought it was such a great idea at the end. So why don't we watch and listen, and we'll come back and talk about it at the end. It is my pleasure today to be talking with my colleague, our Chief Financial and Investment Officer, Gil Alvarado. We're going to be talking about a few financial and investment concepts that are important to our work that we hope to help people understand as they try to understand what we do at the foundation. Gil, thanks for being here.
Great, Grant. It's a pleasure to be here and great to spend some time with you.
Yeah, likewise. We have a lot of fun together, but this is a moment where we have to break down for people in the community exactly what it is that we do. So let me start off by asking you, when we talk about impact investing, which we do a lot, what do we mean by that at the Prebys Foundation?
So, Grant, when we think about impact investing, we think about our resources on our investment portfolio and how we use those resources that carries kind of a dual purpose. It is a resource that's important for investing, but it also has a community benefit. It has an impact to do things in alignment with what we firmly believe in terms of our values. And it also brings an additional amount of resource so that we can use those tools to really be additive to solutions that we think are of value to community, but also have more of a long tail or long term.
So you're saying when we think about an investment at the foundation, we think about how to get a return on it because we have to support the work of the foundation. But you're also saying, in an ideal world, we're also thinking about the impact that investment has in advancing our mission.
Right.
And how is that different from what foundations normally do?
So those are two important pieces to what we consider as impact, because when you think about the roles of function in terms of the investment portfolio, it does have a fiduciary lens to have a certain...
So we have to make money.
We have to make money, and we also use that money to provide grants to the community. So they're two important levers that the foundation has. Impact sleeves carry those same requirements of earning money, but it also aligns with the values of purpose and mission, which carries this doing good and doing well at the same time approach using those resources.
So give us an example, like what excites you about doing impact investing? Because I know that you really get excited about this work and have been a driver of it here at the foundation. So what's a good example?
This is one of the pieces that, you and I have been working together for several years now, and it excites me that our board has allocated a sleeve of resources from the investment portfolio for impact for San Diego. And what that excites me is we have an opportunity to be innovative. We structure these around an entrepreneurial mindset. And what that has allowed us to do is be very opportunistic in, as an example, creating a Prebys Venture Fund.
I was going to ask you how the Prebys Venture Fund fits in it. So say more about that.
So this fund now is designated a $50 million fund for San Diego to invest in life science companies and early growth tech companies that we value, those companies that are influencing the ecosystem of San Diego. But more importantly, it aligns with our values for healthcare, for medical research, and it gives a sense that we can invest in San Diego, for San Diego, in those companies that want to do good in this world. So I'm excited. We brought in a great team, a great staff. We've made 5 investments in this fund already. It was launched in April.
Can you give an example of a company or two that we've invested in that illustrate what we're doing there?
So an example of one, we've invested in a company called Wellbe Health. This is a company that uses telehealth to provide health for access to patients that may not have access. So the quality of health is done through a technology platform. So one, our core premise is we want to invest in companies in San Diego, and we've done so. This is one example. 2, the quality of patient care will be enhanced through using these technology advances in these types of platforms. So we're excited about the use of these platforms. You know, the world today is talking about AI, and they're talking a lot about what's happening in the world of this particular technology. It's exciting. I'm excited that we can use it in a way that benefits community through these vehicles. So that's one example.
Thanks. That's a great example. What's another one that
So-
illustrates the point?
Yeah, Grant. So another one that we're very excited about, Aspen Neuroscience. This is what I would say, just a regenerative science, and it focuses on diseases like Parkinson's, where there are now technologies that will allow quality of life for patients. Really exciting stuff. And we are very proud to invest in San Diego companies that are doing wonderful things with technologies.
I mean, what I'm really taking from that example is how it advances. It's a promising technology, but it advances part of our mission, which is to help with research.
It does. It does 100%. And I think that's part of what we find exciting about Prebys Ventures is that we have opportunities to dive into these conversations, find companies that are doing some really great work and make a decision. And I think those decisions, hopefully over time, will find ourselves in positions not only from the financial side, but really benefiting society. And that's what makes it exciting.
And when we think about scale in the context of a foundation like ours, where in a typical year, let's say that the foundation is doing $50 to $60 million in grants, but you're starting with what you called a sleeve earlier of $100 million in impact investments out of our total $1.2 billion portfolio.
Right.
So a lot of money to work with in that. And the $50 million Prebys Ventures Fund is one piece of that.
Right.
Give us an example of what you're doing outside the $50 million Prebys Ventures Fund.
Sure. So one piece, as we described, is the venture fund. The other piece we call opportunistic. And what that means is we're finding values in ways in which we can contribute to housing, affordable housing.
Yeah.
So we've had several projects that give us an opportunity to really think about what's happening in San Diego. What are the challenges that we're finding in terms of accessibility to affordable housing? And how can we find solutions by investing in those projects that could offer ways to think about what does that mean for San Diego? How can that scale? So that's one example. We also work on different projects around vehicles of investing that carry debt components. So we invest in multiple strategies, one of them being affordable small business loans, in which the fund will allow different companies to have access to loans that are accessible, that would allow them to continue.
So entrepreneurs who otherwise might struggle to attract funding,
Correct.
you're able to, or the foundation is able to provide resources through that vehicle.
Right.
So it's interesting. You can cover a lot of different issues, all related to moving San Diego forward. And how do you think about the foundation's purchase of 401B Street recently?
Yeah.
You know,
Yep.
a big office building in downtown. How does that fit in your construct of this?
So that's an interesting point, Graham, because what we found ourselves in terms of an opportunity to contribute to the impact of civic revitalization. How do we contribute in a meaningful way to look at downtown and
Right.
activate that,
Right.
right? And so on one side of it, looking at it from part of the investment portfolio, it made sense for us to go into an opportunity and buy a commercial real estate property. On the other hand, this gives us now an opportunity to look at an area that's somewhat tired, that leaves an opportunity to give a chance for activation. How can we think about ways to bring community together? How can we change and be a change agent in that space? And so this was just an opportunity that we found ourselves being quite influential, but also one that we have committed to a long-term investment, and we're the right players to do so. Foundations have an ability to be long-term capital deployers, meaning we can sit out certain cycles of economies that are much more favorable than other types of investors in that case. So,
I want to acknowledge, by the way, that the role you've played in all of the investments you've described has been so critical, because you're not only a willing partner in those discussions, in many cases you're the leader. And I remember vividly the moment when we were discussing the purchase of the downtown office building, you saying to me, you know, we've got to diversify our portfolio anyway. Real estate needs to be in the portfolio. We could be buying a REIT in some nameless city, or we can invest in our own community. And that was the conversation that put the deal over the top, which is my way of saying I blame you. um, let me ask you finally, in this quick overview, how you think about the difference that these investments make in the lives of San Diegans.
Yeah.
Some of our grants, it's very clear. You know, we're funding medical research directly. We're funding healthcare clinics directly. We're funding arts organizations where people go and feel a sense of community directly. How should they think about how they're affected by these investments that we're making out of the portfolio?
it's a great conversation around what we feel is our role in the community, and that is we want to use 100% of our resources, not just grants, but all investments to benefit the community. And it may show up directly, as you mentioned, in grants, and it may show up indirectly. And what I mean by that is Prebys offers opportunities on the investment side that may not be the name value at the front of the list. We may be a part of the solution. But I think through that process, community can benefit from, as an example, affordable housing, where they may find an opportunity where an individual could have access to a unit that's accessible, affordable, and yet in the background, Prebys had some role in the financing or the tranching to get to that point. So it won't be face value and it's behind the scenes, but it offers ways to benefit community that in time we will find our name in a lot of different places that will have meaningful purpose for with community. And I think that's really exciting for me because it's part of our work is we can approach solutions in different ways that offer solutions to community that others may not be able to. And that's a real value, I think, to this community. When Conrad Prebys gave us this wonderful gift that he gave San Diego, it really set in motion for me personally, how can we be as creative and innovative as possible on all levels so that we utilize our resources to be one, impactful, but also prioritize community for San Diego's good. And I think it shows from our board, it shows from our staff, it shows from you, particularly Grant, as our CEO, the ability for us to use all of our resources for purpose, and whether it's short term or long term, I think we're going to have a real strong influence in this community.
I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about how you got here, because you have an interesting origin story, and I think it helps for people to know a little bit about the staff at the foundation.
Sure.
I'm curious about the journey that got you to this space where you're this high-flying CFO, CIO, working in this impact investing space. 2 decades of work in philanthropy and tell us a little bit about what got you here.
Sure. Grant, I've always said that I didn't find philanthropy. Philanthropy found me.
It's true for a lot of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was a different course. I've always been interested in healthcare. When I first graduated from college and had my degree and moved into that route, I always wanted to focus on healthcare. And so my goal was to move into becoming a CEO of a hospital system, which I was right on course. Through that process and through kind of just the way things happened, we ended up selling that system, formed a foundation, and
Suddenly you're in philanthropy. Yeah.
And I never looked back. And through that process, I've learned a lot about myself. I've learned about what I care about. And through that process, I have always leaned towards 3 fundamental pillars, philanthropy, education, and investments. And I've lived through that kind of basis that has really guided me on this journey. I can say by far that I've learned more in this last 3 years as a team member and as part of the leadership team on how to use all those tools that I've experienced in a way that has been just a really amazing journey.
Yeah.
So it's been fun.
Well, I'm thrilled to be on it with you. I'm still curious about your background that got you here, though, because and I'm trying to decide to go further back or to further up. But so I'm going to go further back first,
Okay.
and then come back to the healthcare experience that you had. Because you've talked about in other contexts the role that your grandfather played in sort of shaping your worldview. And I wonder if you would just share a little bit about that.
Sure. My grandfather was a pillar in my life in terms of how he just brought a positive energy, always reminding me to stay hungry, not just food-wise,
Yeah.
in life. And, I always refer to him as the young old. He was very young at heart, and he carried with him a beacon of always looking forward, but with a sense of optimism. The positive nature and the energy that he portrayed really had an influence on how meaningful life can be when you have the right attitude to take on the challenges that you face. We can all dive into the negativity that we see, and it's very easy to fall on that course. I think what it brought to me were really 3 areas of confidence. 1, having a positive attitude. 2, looking forward to the future. But 3, remembering where you came from. I think that's really important because it set ground for me to recognize for myself, for my family, for my kids, that it's important to have grounding, but also with those same fundamental values that he taught me, I can see it in my kids. I can see it in the team that I work with. And my hope is that if I can continue working in that way to change, to be a change agent, to have influence, I can think, I've done a
That's
pretty
pretty
good
cool.
job for a lot.
You, I can attest from having watched you that you convey those values to your own kids. I'm curious, when was it your grandfather who helped you develop these three pillars you were talking about: philanthropy, education, and investments, or did that come later?
It came later, Grant. What I found myself involved with more and more is, finding my course, like everyone does. You find your course. And through that process, I ended up finding a course in philanthropy where I've moved through life through several different foundations in different parts of the country. Through those conversations, I did end up in education, an adjunct professor at University of San Francisco, and that gave me an opportunity to really experience the graduate programs of finance and really the energy of students and what that brings. And then when you think about investing, I come from an accounting background, but yeah, I'm probably not your typical accountant. I do tend to move towards probably more entrepreneurial spirit, and through that process, I found a love for investing.
Yeah.
And with that, it's carried an opportunity for me to learn not only what I can bring to the foundation, but I carry other roles in leadership and other board service where it's given me an opportunity to look globally at what is happening in the world and use investment as a vehicle to really find myself thinking about the future. And it's exciting.
Yeah, I really like how you formulate that part of your story, and it makes me want to come back to your accidental entree into philanthropy.
Yeah.
So you're with this health system that decides that it's going to sell off and form a foundation, and you're suddenly with the foundation. Um, and that's Sierra Health, correct?
This was before Sierra Health. This was Paso del Norte Health Foundation. This was a very similar, a border city.
Yeah,
In
because you were living in El Paso at
That's
the
right.
time.
That's
Yeah.
right. So the fundamentals of El Paso and San Diego are very similar. The culture, binational, you have Juarez, Mexico, you have El Paso, you have Tijuana. And that was my first initial experience around jumping into philanthropy.
Okay.
And
And then when you went to work at Sierra Health, you really started getting into some of the impact investing work. And what was it there that made it either important for you to begin to explore impact investing or possible? I mean,
Yeah.
how did you get there?
I felt that Sierra Health gave me an opportunity to become more entrepreneurial in how I advanced our strategies. An example of that is we had a private foundation, but we also developed a startup 501c3, and that 501c3 over time, over 12 years, we grew into a business of over $1 billion in federal and government contracts. So the idea
Over $1 billion.
over $1 billion, and
Yeah.
so that gave us a chance to redirect our mind and process to a revenue-based model away from a foundation model. And so this gave, again, another question around what else could we do to have impact? 'Cause both organizations carried impact regionally, but also statewide. That also began the journey to develop the San Joaquin Valley Impact Investment Fund, where I served as president of that fund in the Central Valley, under the idea that the Central Valley of California is underserved in terms of capital. And so as a result, we formed a fund that would allow us to develop affordable loans through CDFI mechanisms. And through that process, I really began to learn how challenging it can be both fundraise and to develop strategy. But it taught me a lot about how you approach impact investing from a community base and have an all-inclusive model that really allows for some really spectacular results, which very
Like, give an example of what was spectacular that you take a lot of pride in from that time.
so I take a lot of pride because we developed what I find exciting, like any startup, which Prebys in a way, you think about it, it is my third startup. And what's exciting is you begin with an idea, and then that idea gets shared. And then that excitement raises the level of the energy in the room. And then that energy actually creates a product.
Yeah.
And that's what's exciting. The product was the fund, and the fund then deployed capital to the CDFI, the banks. And then from the bank,
Which is the community intermediary that gives money to community development organizations and facilitates the whole engine of community growth.
that's right. And so you see these community members now benefiting from an idea, and that is exciting.
So, Gil, you're networked nationally. You go to you know all the folks at the major foundations who are your counterparts, and you've spoken at all the conferences. And surely you must feel that you've proven this model over and over again, and yet it still remains a relatively rare thing in the philanthropy, large foundation field and correct me if I'm wrong about that, but it's my perception that the majority of foundations still find themselves in the position of wanting to invest their assets in a way that maximizes the returns without considering social impact, and then doing the social impact through the grant making.
Right.
So why is that old mindset still so dominant?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you attempt to persuade people to think about it differently?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is a large percentage of foundations out there, Grant, that see two sides of the coin. The side that generates the money or the income, the investment side, and the philanthropic side, and there is a divide. I think the challenge you face with a lot of governance aspects around that is really around legacy. So what I find is in entrepreneurial or early stage foundations, you have an easier route to have new ideas and new roles versus, say, a historic foundation has been around for X amount of years. It's very hard to churn that engine to a different engine.
Right. Yeah.
So that's one aspect. I believe the power of change for that is by example. If you can see an example of, say, a solution that happened in another city or another situation or the project, then I think that offers a way for those foundations to ask themselves, how can we maybe think about different ways to maybe replicate or to find ways that find solutions in that same manner. And so, yeah.
So one level, I think it's such a great observation that one level of pushback that happens with foundations when they consider this is, but we have an entire history of doing it this way.
Yeah.
So legacy, you referred to it as that. And it's easier. And, in our condition, we didn't have that history. So our board was willing to look at it and say, why not do it a different way? Because we didn't do it that way. So that's one thing that gets in the way. But isn't there still a perception that impact investments are not as good as regular investments?
There is in the field,
Mm-hmm.
as investments field or investment finance, there is a perception that you have a certain risk attribute to the portfolio, meaning you can only make money a certain way, and this may be a dilutive component to that, meaning it's going to take away from returns. I think that school is yet out to be determined, because there is proof that you can still have great returns with impact strategies.
Right.
And so there is, I think, leadership is key to this, particularly on the investment and finance world. And I think you're finding more and more influence on that. But I would say, Grant, for the majority of foundations, there is still a heavy covenants to the investment side being separated because of a couple of other factors. The way those foundations are structured, from the compensation to the attributes of how those particular functions are rewarded, don't allow for maybe opportunity for them to take some lens of risk. And so you have those systems baked in, and sometimes that needs a little changing. And I think if you can have change to that layer, it could be influential in that.
I think what's important about that is, a number of things, but one of the things that leaps up at me is, in fairness to folks who are struggling with this still, as they look at risk, some of these investments are harder to quantify in terms of the risk that they represent, right? It's just a fact that is, because there's so little history in investing in those spaces, or community investment might be a one-off, and then how do you gauge the risk of it? It's harder.
It is harder. And I do recognize that, the toolkit, the toolbox that every foundation has in this scenario, you have a line, and that line defines below market rate tools.
Yeah.
In the case of below market rate, that could be what's called a program related investment, or a grant where there's no return,
Or a
to
loan,
very small,
yeah.
or a loan. And then you have market rate, which are a blend of impact and investment grade, which is a mission related investment. And then you have your kind of pure investment that doesn't factor in these considerations. I think that's very real.
Yeah.
And I think for foundations, what has always been powerful for me is that you can blend all of this in an aggregate target. So in other words, you can take all of these pieces and add them all up. And if you can add them to a number that's a certain number or higher, then that's your solution.
Yeah.
But if you're always aiming for as high and optimized, and there's no wiggle room, it makes it very challenging.
Yeah.
These conversations.
So folks who are responsible for investment portfolios spend a lot of time thinking about that. As you talk to folks around the country about this, I want to come back to this. How do you persuade them to care? Why does it, from your perspective, you've done this work now for a couple of decades, and you've modeled different ways of doing it.
Right.
You started a couple of funds to do the work. When you explain to people why it matters without lecturing them, sure, because nobody wants to be lectured and everybody's dealing with their own stuff. But why does it matter that foundations get better at doing this work?
It matters, Grant, because foundations have a certain level of responsibility that's quite different than any other entity or organization or industry. I think for those that are leading foundations, particularly on the investment side, there is really three areas that are differentials. One, long-term capital. The foundations in perpetuity, meaning they're here to stay in the kind of forever phase. Patient capital is our advantage. And with that, you have an opportunity and a responsibility, in my opinion, to really think about what those resources bring to community. And you have the affordability to have longer tails in time. So that's one aspect of being a differential. The other aspect is, as you enter into conversations with community and the needs are there, grants will carry a certain time length. It's kind of like if you're thinking about being a a bond manager. You call it a duration or a yield curve, and the bonds can be at certain points. Grants are at a certain point. You have other tools. And so I think educating those in that space around what the spectrum of all tools offer, because it is a spectrum. But at the end of the day, everything's about risk. And I think foundations carry the same amount of risk as any other fund out there, any for-profit fund with a different alternative to the outcomes. But the carrying of responsibility, I think, in the foundation world for these roles of leadership should always be focused on community. I think that's fundamental. And if you're not in that space, and if your mind is not geared towards that level, I think it may not be the right industry for you to be thinking about. So
Yeah, but I love that. I love that the way you both started and ended with the sense of responsibility that comes with having these massive resources and thinking about how to deploy them more fully, not just through grants, but through investments in ways that are consistent with mission, I think is a very powerful statement. Not as easy as it sounds, because I think sometimes people oversimplify that,
right.
and make it sound like if you and I decided tomorrow that we wanted to go to our board and say we want to deploy the full $1.2 billion of our assets in impact investments, the first question they'd ask us is, what are those opportunities? And it takes a long time to realize those opportunities.
To that point, Grant, the basis around managing a portfolio, when you think about the investments that are not per se earmarked for investing, those have a certain cadence on risk tolerance and a certain cadence on time and a certain cadence on how you think about those attributes: philosophy, people, process. Impact strategies take a longer time to develop. These are, at the fundamental level, you could think of them as 10-year projects. And so when you think about 10-year projects, what does it take to think about starting those projects, the relationships, the investors, the strategic partners? And it takes time. And at the end of the day, that time can be evaluated and measured both on impact, how did that influence community, and on return. Did you meet your KPIs or your indicators to the return that you were seeking?
Now, I don't want to get too far ahead of where we are right now, but I do want to signal how broadly we can think about or are thinking about this. The way that you have structured it so far is we have made a major commitment through the Prebys Venture Fund of $50 million to support, and we've talked about that, to invest in companies that are advancing the frontiers of medical research and what we call life sciences. Then you talked about the opportunistic opportunities that will come our way, some of which include affordable housing as an example, where we're trying to make investments that increase the supply of affordable housing. We've talked about the way in which we've made a major real estate investment to advance the redevelopment of downtown and the civic center in particular through the purchase of a downtown office building. But you're thinking even more broadly as you look at this. You're looking at San Diego as an economy and an ecosystem, and you've been thinking about the future of climate change, which is going to have and is already having real effects on the community. And you're looking at the blue economy, which this community is uniquely positioned to take advantage of because of where we sit. And can you just say a few words about how you're seeing the synthesis of a
Sure.
of a green economy, blue economy play at a time in history what doesn't seem favorable for that?
You're right, Grant, and I think you've captured the essence of what we all think about in terms of the health, particularly San Diego. San Diego's ecosystem is quite unique compared to other parts of the country. You know, I was just in Berlin last week, and the investment conversations are far more different than the investment conversations here in the United States.
In what way? What do you mean by that?
More geared towards sustainability, alternative or green technologies, looking at climate as a priority, factors known as ESG, environmental, social governance.
Which are embattled right now because of the administration's views on those.
That's right. And so with that, you know, looking at how we can still pivot the portfolio to the blue economy in ways that
Explain the blue economy.
Sure.
I used the term, but explain what it means.
So the blue economy, when we think about all the resources, including the ocean, you know, what makes the ocean a resource for community? And you can think about water, waste, energy. All of those factors can be a part of that kind of lens of what that resource carries. Climate is a big factor in that category because you have an influence that is correlated to that. And so we think of the blue economy in San Diego as what are the challenges we face? The Tijuana River is one aspect that has enormous impact, whether it's Department of Defense, whether it's the Navy, whether you think about the public health aspect, when you think about the economic influence, that is front and center influencing having a impact on San Diego. When you think about waste and energy, we think about the energy transition. We all have cars that are either hybrids or electric. How is that going to be powered in the future? What are the sources? So those aspects are really influential in how we're thinking about what are the solutions, what are the ideas and technologies that are going to be generated, particularly out of San Diego. There's a lot of conversation around what is the next iteration of supporting as we all are looking at AI. I've heard a stat that over the next 10 years or so, it's going to be amounting to something like 8% of our total power is going to be focused on supporting this AI technology. Where is that energy going to come from? What is the impact on the...
So the advances of a company like General Atomics, which is based here working on fusion,
Right.
and the work of companies that are working on sustainable solar or wind or whatever, all become more important.
More important. And I do feel that that is one element of the importance of thinking about where can portfolio resources have a game-changing impact, maybe not in the short term, but over time contribute to that. Another element may be infrastructure. When we think about, you know, what is today's world in terms of looking at pollution aspects, looking at how environment is impacted, what are ways in which there are solutions or technology. When we think about the creative economy, how can we support that? The creative economy, meaning entrepreneurs that are on the ground thinking about starting a company, whether they're artists, bakers, you know, that is the small business dream of how do you support your family by creating something in your own business and growing that. We talked a lot about, you and I, about ESOPs and how employee-owned companies have a value.
Building wealth for future generations, right?
And there was last week, Mark Cuban talked exactly about this, pushing more ownership.
It's Mark and us, you know.
I know, we need to continue to talk to them. So you're right, Grant. There's a lot of ground to cover. And I think the other...
So let me ask you then, and we'll wrap up here, but let me ask you then, I mean, it's so exciting to talk about these things. And what I hear you describing is a kind of comprehensive picture of how, through our investments, to move San Diego forward as a national and international leader on these important fronts. And yet, there's always a small voice in our heads or in adjacent spaces where people are talking to us saying, you guys have a nice portfolio, but it's a trivial amount of money compared to the size of your economy.
Right.
So why does our portfolio matter?
Our portfolio matters, Grant, because we have a voice through the resources that we carry. And that voice matters because collectively that voice can carry change. And while if you think about the scale and magnitude of what we are facing, sometimes it's a daunting thought. But our portfolio matters because we can actually have change at a level locally, which then grows regionally, which then grows nationally. And if you can create momentum by using those resources, I think it's a very powerful thing. It's a little bit of a bottom-up approach in some ways, but I do feel, given the size of our portfolio, even though trivial, it is meaningful.
Yeah.
And I think if you can impact that meaningful resource in a very focused or deliberate way and bring on strategic partners, I think you can find yourself in some pretty amazing opportunities in the future.
Gil Alvarado, from your lips to God's ears, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for doing this with me and for doing it all with me. You're a great partner.
Likewise, Grant, I appreciate everything that we do and appreciate the partnership and working with you as well.
All right. Excellent. So, Crystal, I just have to say, hats off to you for thinking about doing this. And I thought that discussion with Gil was extraordinary. It's a really important premise for Prebys that we use everything we've got to make a difference in San Diego. And that includes grant making, but it includes communications and the messaging we provide the community, and it includes all of our assets. And Gil was so good on that piece.
Yeah. Well, and I hope that this episode is going to help our team or anyone who watches it better understand what we mean when we say impact investing, right? Because what I'm walking away with is understanding that we can invest and yield some sort of return that then goes back into our grant making and back into community. And I think sometimes when we hear terms like investment, it may feel like a barrier to people. Right. But really, it's just how are we directing money to help further?
Yeah, and his way of illustrating that and helping us, walk through, well, it means investing our assets in some significant measure in San Diego or in the issues that we care about. And Prebys Ventures, that it's investing in companies that are doing the cutting edge life sciences work that's really important to our commitments around health and medical research. And showing how all of that ties together and can produce a return that continues to support the grant making of the foundation.
Yeah. Well, and it's almost like a double investment in things like life science, right? Because there's the grant making side of it, and then there's this investment in the tech and things. So I just find it super exciting because, at least for me, those worlds never quite felt accessible. But then to hear us talk about how Prebys is playing a role in this and what that future could be, I think hopefully it opens more doors for more people.
I hope so. I mean, this idea that that foundations should play a larger and greater role than just giving away money, but should be thinking about how to use 100% of what they have in advancing their mission is really powerful, and I think important for philanthropy in the modern age. I also think it's really interesting to hear Gil talk about some of the other ways in which we're doing that, where we're focusing on affordable housing and entrepreneurship and small business development. Very important in terms of the overall impact of the foundation on the region.
And I would just invite anyone who listens or watches Stop and Talk, come back anytime in the next year, and we'll continue to tell the stories and update on impact investing, sharing our stories around housing. it's just such an honor to get to work with you and Gil and this whole team.
Well, likewise. And thank you for joining us for this episode. And we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Stop. Talk to me.